The inheritance lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Maya Chen, he said, his voice cutting through the stunned silence of the conference room, you are the sole beneficiary of Eleanor Chen's estate, valued at $85 million. The room went dead quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Jessica's mouth hung open, her designer coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. Just 20 minutes earlier, she'd been laughing with her friends about my spare change lifestyle, making jokes about how I probably counted quarters to afford lunch. Now she sat there watching me inherit more money than she'd see in 10 lifetimes. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other family obligation I dreaded. Grandmother's memorial service had ended 3 hours ago, and now we were all crammed into Uncle Robert's living room in his sprawling Hillsdale home. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. While everyone else wore black designer dresses and tailored suits, I sat in my thrift store cardigan and the only pair of dress pants I owned, bought on clearance 2 years ago. The fabric was starting to pill at the knees, but it was clean and pressed, which was the best I could manage on a bookstore clerk's salary. Jessica swept through the front door like she was walking a red carpet, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors with practiced precision. Everything about her screamed success, from her perfectly straightened hair to the way she held her phone like it was a prop in a photoshoot. She worked in marketing for one of Portland's trendy tech startups, the kind of place where people wore expensive sneakers to meetings and called conference rooms things like the think tank and innovation station. She posted about her life constantly, sharing photos of artisanal cocktails and weekend trips to wine country, always with captions about living my best life and grateful for the hustle. Her mother, Aunt Carmen, followed close behind, both of them air-kissing relatives and speaking in the kind of voices that carried across rooms. They moved through the space like they owned it, which in a way they did. Uncle Robert had always favored Carmen over my father, and after Dad died 5 years ago, that preference became even more obvious. Carmen got the family updates, the holiday hosting duties, the assumption that her opinion mattered. Jessica inherited that sense of belonging, that casual confidence that came from never questioning whether you deserved to be in the room. I watched them work the crowd from my spot on the couch, tucked between elderly neighbors who smelled like mothballs and spoke in whispers about how much the house must be worth. Nobody approached me except to offer condolences about grandmother, and even those felt obligatory. They'd pat my shoulder, say something about how peaceful she looked, then drift away to find more interesting conversations. I'd become the family afterthought, the one they remembered existed only when someone asked where Maya was. The thing about being invisible is that you hear everything. Jessica was holding court near the kitchen island, entertaining David Kim and Sophie Williams, with stories about her latest promotion. She gestured with her wine glass like she was conducting an orchestra, her voice getting louder with each sip. The client loved my campaign concept so much they doubled the budget, she was saying. I told my boss we should pivot the entire Q4 strategy around my approach. Sometimes you just have to trust your instincts, you know. David nodded along enthusiastically. He'd known Jessica since college and seemed genuinely impressed by her success, asking follow-up questions about metrics and market penetration that made her preen with pride. Sophie, on the other hand, kept glancing around the room like she was cataloging everything for future reference. She worked in real estate and had a way of assessing spaces that made you feel like she was mentally calculating square footage and resale value. Maya's here too, David said at one point, nodding in my direction. It wasn't meant to be dismissive, just factual, but somehow it felt like both. Jessica turned to look at me, her smile shifting into something that might have been sympathy if it weren't so practiced. Oh yes, Maya, how are you holding up? I know grandmother's passing must be especially hard since you two were so close. The way she emphasized close made it sound like quotation marks, like she was referencing something everyone understood but nobody talked about. The truth was, grandmother and I had been close, in our own quiet way. while Jessica and her mother made their obligatory holiday visits, full of loud conversation and expensive gifts that got displayed for a week then forgotten. I'd been the one who visited regularly. I brought her library books she'd requested, sat with her during doctor's appointments, listened to stories about her childhood that she'd told 100 times, but seemed to need to tell again. I didn't post about these visits on social media or mention them in family conversations. They weren't performances, they were just time we spent together. She was a wonderful woman, I said simply. I'll miss our Saturday afternoons. Sophie tilted her head with the kind of curiosity that preceded judgment. Saturday afternoons. Maya would read to her, Aunt Carmen explained, appearing beside Jessica with fresh wine. Such a sweet gesture. Grandmother always appreciated simple pleasures. The word simple hung in the air like smoke, seeming to expand beyond the reading sessions to encompass everything about my life. Jessica picked up the thread seamlessly. It's actually really admirable how Maya has embraced the minimalist lifestyle. Not everyone can be comfortable with so little. She gestured vaguely at my outfit, her tone suggesting she was complimenting my ability to make poverty look intentional. I read this article about how financial stress can actually be liberating once you stop trying to keep up appearances. Very zen. The conversation continued around me, with Jessica leading a discussion about the pressures of success and how refreshing it must be to opt out of that race entirely. She talked about my life like it was a philosophical choice rather than a collection of circumstances, turning my modest apartment and second-hand clothes into evidence of spiritual enlightenment rather than economic reality. David and Sophie nodded along, occasionally glancing at me with the kind of sympathetic expressions people reserved for recovering addicts or terminal patients. I could have corrected them. I could have mentioned that I'd chosen my job at the bookstore because I loved being surrounded by stories, not because I couldn't find anything better. I could have explained that my small apartment in Hawthorne was exactly what I wanted, close to coffee shops and walking trails, full of light and completely mine. I could have told them about the money I sent to various charities each month, or the emergency fund I'd been building for years, or the fact that I'd never once felt poor in any way that mattered. Instead, I nodded along and let them construct their version of my reality. It seemed important to them, this narrative where Jessica was succeeding and I was surviving, where her achievements meant more because mine meant less. I sipped my tea and smiled when appropriate and let them feel generous in their assumptions about my contentment with so little. The afternoon wore on like that, with conversations swirling around me but rarely including me. Jessica dominated most discussions, sharing updates about her condo purchase and the vacation she was planning to Italy. She'd pull out her phone to show pictures of restaurants she wanted to try and hotels she was considering, each image accompanied by commentary about thread counts and Michelin stars, and the importance of experiencing authentic culture rather than tourist traps. Maya, you should come visit me in my new place once I'm settled, she offered at one point. It's right in the Pearl District, walking distance to everything. The building has this amazing rooftop deck with city views. I think you'd love it. Her invitation sounded genuine, but there was something underneath it, a subtle emphasis that suggested she was offering me a glimpse of a world I'd never be able to afford myself. I thanked her and said I'd like that, though we both knew I probably wouldn't take her up on it. These invitations were part of the family dance we'd been doing for years, gestures that looked generous on the surface, but came with invisible conditions. Jessica got to feel magnanimous for including me, and I got to feel appropriately grateful for the privilege of her proximity to success. As the gathering began to wind down, people started making their way to the door with promises to stay in touch and reminders about upcoming family events. Jessica hugged me goodbye, squeezing my shoulders in a way that felt both affectionate and condescending.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Care of yourself, she said, her voice soft with concern, and remember there's no shame in asking for help if you need it. We're family. I watched her walk to her BMW, where she spent a few minutes adjusting her mirrors and connecting her phone to the sound system. Through the windshield, I could see her typing something, probably updating her social media with thoughts about family and gratitude and the importance of staying humble. She drove away with the kind of confidence that came from never doubting where she belonged in the world. The irony wasn't lost on me that in a few hours, everything they thought they knew about my life would turn upside down. None of them had any idea about Great Aunt Eleanor's letter, the one that had arrived 3 weeks earlier requesting my presence at Morrison Law offices for a matter concerning your inheritance. I'd assumed it was something small, maybe a piece of jewelry or a few $100s she'd managed to save. Eleanor had always been the family mystery, grandmother's older sister who'd moved away decades ago and lived quietly in a small town outside Seattle. She sent Christmas cards but rarely visited, and when she did, she dressed simply and spoke softly and gave no indication that she had money to spare. I'd taken the afternoon off work to attend the lawyer meeting, telling my manager at the bookstore that I had family business to handle. The appointment was scheduled for tomorrow at 2 o'clock, and I'd planned to take the bus downtown and maybe treat myself to lunch afterward if the inheritance was enough to cover it. I certainly hadn't expected anything that would change my life, let alone anything that would change how my family saw me. But as I drove home in my 12-year-old Honda Civic, listening to the engine make the rattling sound that probably meant I needed a tune-up I couldn't afford, I couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow was going to be different somehow. Maybe it was just the strange energy that comes after funerals, the way death makes everything feel uncertain and possible at the same time, or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't name but could feel in the quiet spaces between my thoughts. I pulled into my apartment complex as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that made even the aging buildings look beautiful. My neighbors were out walking their dogs and watering their small gardens, going about their evening routines with the kind of contentment that comes from simple pleasures. I waved to Mrs. Patterson, who always asked about my day at the bookstore, and helped Mr. Garcia carry his groceries upstairs. These were my people, the ones who knew me as Maya the neighbor, Maya the young woman who worked at Powell's and always had a book recommendation, Maya who existed without needing to explain or justify or apologize for the space she took up in the world. Inside my apartment, I made a simple dinner and sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker on across the river. Tomorrow I would learn what Great Aunt Eleanor had left me, and life would continue much as it always had. I had no reason to expect otherwise, no indication that in less than 24 hours, Jessica's carefully constructed worldview would crumble around her like paper in rain. But sometimes the universe has a sense of humor about these things. Sometimes the people who spend the most time looking down on others are the ones who have the farthest to fall when the truth finally surfaces. And sometimes, just sometimes, the quiet ones who never ask for anything are exactly the ones who deserve everything. The contrast between Jessica and me had been building for years, but it crystallized that Tuesday morning when I walked into Morrison Law offices wearing the same black dress I'd worn to grandmother's funeral. The fabric was starting to fade slightly at the seams, and I'd noticed a small thread pulling loose near the hem, but it was the most professional outfit I owned. I'd paired it with my only pair of dress shoes, comfortable flats I'd bought at a discount store 3 years ago that had held up remarkably well despite regular wear. The law office occupied 3 floors of a downtown high-rise, all gleaming marble and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Willamette River. The reception area smelled like expensive leather and fresh flowers, with furniture that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than a waiting room. I gave my name to the receptionist, a woman in her 30s who wore the kind of makeup that probably took an hour to apply perfectly. She glanced at her computer screen, then looked me up and down with barely concealed confusion. Maya Chen for the 2 o'clock appointment, she repeated, as if saying it again might change something. With Mr. Morrison regarding the Eleanor Chen estate, I nodded and took a seat on one of the leather chairs, trying not to think about how out of place I looked in this environment. The other people in the waiting area wore suits that probably cost more than I made in a month, carrying briefcases and talking quietly into phones about mergers and acquisitions. I clutched my small purse and tried to look like I belonged, even though every instinct told me I was about to waste someone's very expensive time. Meanwhile, across town, Jessica was holding court in the break room of her tech company, surrounded by coworkers who hung on her every word like she was dispensing wisdom from on high. She'd been talking about the memorial service all morning, spinning the family gathering into a narrative that painted her as both successful and compassionate, the kind of person who stayed connected to her roots despite her obvious upward trajectory. It's just sad, she was saying to Marcus, the graphic designer who had a crush on her and always volunteered to work on her projects. My cousin Maya has so much potential, but she's just stuck in this cycle of underachievement. She works at a bookstore making barely above minimum wage, lives in this tiny apartment in a sketchy neighborhood, takes the bus everywhere because she can't afford a decent car. Tiffany from HR nodded sympathetically while stirring sugar into her latte. That's tough. Is she looking for something better? Jessica shrugged with the kind of exaggerated helplessness that suggested she'd tried everything possible to help. I've offered to put in a word for her here, but she always says she's happy where she is. I think it's easier to stay comfortable in mediocrity than to risk failing at something bigger. Some people just aren't cut out for ambition. The conversation continued in that vein, with Jessica positioning herself as the concerned family member who wanted to help but couldn't force someone to want more for themselves. She talked about my thrift store clothes and second-hand furniture with the kind of pitying concern usually reserved for discussing distant relatives who'd fallen on hard times. Her co-workers made appropriate sympathetic noises and praised Jessica for maintaining such a caring relationship with someone so different from herself. I keep inviting her to things, Jessica continued, but I think she feels uncomfortable around my friends. Like last weekend, I was at this amazing new restaurant in the Pearl District, and I thought about asking her to join us, but the entrees start at $40 and I didn't want to put her in an awkward position. Marcus nodded knowingly. It's hard when there's such a big income gap in families. You want to include people, but you also don't want to make them feel bad about what they can't afford. What none of them knew was that while Jessica was performing her charitable concern for an audience of impressed coworkers, I was sitting in a lawyer's office about to discover that great-aunt Eleanor had quietly accumulated a fortune that would make Jessica's tech salary look like pocket change. Eleanor had been one of the early investors in a small software company that had grown into a major player in the industry, and she'd never sold her shares. She'd also inherited property from her late husband that had appreciated dramatically over the decades, plus investments and savings that had been growing steadily for 40 years. But back in that break room, Jessica was just getting started with her performance. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her Instagram feed, showing her coworkers photos from her recent weekend in wine country. This is why I try to live in the moment and enjoy the success I've worked for, she said, swiping through images of herself posing with glasses of wine and artfully plated food. Life is short, and if you have the means to experience beautiful things, why not? The photos were perfectly curated, each one capturing Jessica in flattering light with carefully chosen backgrounds that suggested wealth without being ostentatious. She'd mastered the art of humble bragging, posting captions about being grateful for opportunities and blessed to work hard and play harder, that managed to showcase her lifestyle while maintaining plausible deniability about showing off. Maya doesn't really do social media, Jessica added, putting her phone away. I think she finds it overwhelming. When you're struggling financially, it probably feels bad to see other people enjoying things you can't afford. I try to be sensitive about that. Tiffany made a soft sound of understanding. That's so thoughtful of you. It must be hard to navigate that balance. Jessica basked in the praise, accepting compliments about her emotional intelligence and family loyalty with practiced modesty. She'd perfected this routine over the years, using my situation as proof of her own success while simultaneously demonstrating her compassion for the less fortunate. I was her favorite example of everything she'd avoided becoming, the cautionary tale that made her achievements feel more impressive by comparison. At exactly 2 o'clock, Mr. Morrison's assistant appeared in the waiting room and called my name. I followed her down a carpeted hallway lined with oil paintings and diplomas, trying not to feel intimidated by the obvious expense of everything around me. The assistant knocked on a heavy wooden door and ushered me into an office that was larger than my entire apartment. Mr. Morrison was a distinguished man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of presence that came from decades of handling important matters for important people. He stood when I entered and shook my hand with genuine warmth, which surprised me. I'd expected him to be formal and distant, the kind of lawyer who charged by the minute and made you feel grateful for his time. "Please sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk. "I'm sorry for your loss. Eleanor spoke of you often, that caught me off guard." "She did? Oh yes, she was very proud of you, Maya. She mentioned your visits with your grandmother, how patient and kind you were with her. Eleanor valued kindness above almost everything else." He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. "She also mentioned that your family doesn't fully appreciate who you are. I think she would have enjoyed knowing how surprised they're going to be." I shifted in my chair, uncertain what he meant. The inheritance couldn't be that significant, could it? Eleanor had lived modestly, dressed simply, never gave any indication that she had substantial money. I'd assumed this meeting was about a small bequest, maybe enough to cover a few months of expenses or a modest vacation. Morrison adjusted his glasses and looked at me with something that might have been amusement. "Eleanor Chen was worth approximately $85 million when she passed away last month. And she's left everything to you." The words hit me like cold water. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, did you say 85 million? "I did. The bulk of it comes from her early investment in what became a major software company, plus real estate holdings and conservative investments that have grown substantially over 4 decades. She was quite financially astute, though she chose to live simply." He slid a document across the desk. "This is a summary of the estate. As you can see, it includes property in 3 states, a diversified portfolio of stocks and bonds, and liquid assets totaling just over $12 million. I picked up the document with hands that had suddenly become unsteady. The numbers swam on the page, too large to process properly. $85 million. More money than I could spend in several lifetimes. More money than Jessica made in a year, or 10 years, or possibly ever. There are some conditions," Mr. Morrison continued, his voice gentle but businesslike. "Eleanor was very specific about how she wanted this handled. She's left detailed instructions about charitable donations she'd like you to consider, though they're suggestions rather than requirements. She's also requested that you maintain her privacy about the inheritance for at least 6 months, to give you time to adjust without outside pressure." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was absorbing everything he was saying. The room felt smaller suddenly, like the walls were closing in despite its enormous size. "Why me?" I managed to ask. "I mean, there are other family members. Jessica is much more successful, more capable of handling something like this, Mr." Morrison smiled, and for the first time since I'd entered his office, he looked genuinely amused. "Eleanor was very clear about that. She said that Jessica already had everything she needed to succeed in life, and that you were the one who understood the value of things that couldn't be bought. She believed you'd use this responsibility wisely." As he spoke, I thought about Jessica back at her office, probably still regaling her coworkers with stories about her charitable patience with her struggling cousin. She'd built her entire sense of self around being the successful one, the family member who'd made something of herself while others fell behind. This inheritance would shatter that narrative completely, and part of me felt sick, thinking about how it would affect her, but another part of me, a part I barely acknowledged, felt something else entirely. For years I'd watched Jessica use my modest lifestyle as proof of her own superiority. She'd made me into her favorite example of what happened when people didn't work hard enough, or want enough, or try hard enough. She'd turned my contentment into failure, and my simplicity into inadequacy, always with that tone of loving concern that made it impossible to argue with. Morrison was still talking, explaining details about trusts and tax implications, and the team of financial advisors Eleanor had arranged to help me navigate this new reality. I tried to focus on his words, but my mind kept drifting to that break room conversation Jessica was probably still having, describing my limitations to anyone who would listen. The transition will take several weeks to complete, he was saying. In the meantime, I'd recommend keeping this information private until you've had time to process it fully. Sudden wealth can attract unwanted attention and complicate family relationships. I almost laughed at that. Family relationships were already complicated enough, built as they were on assumptions about who deserved what and who had earned their place in the hierarchy. Jessica's sense of superiority wasn't just about money, it was about validation, about being seen as the one who'd figured out how to succeed while others hadn't. Learning that I was now worth more than she'd ever dreamed of earning would challenge everything she believed about merit and reward and the natural order of things. There's one more thing, Mr. Morrison said, pulling out a sealed envelope. Eleanor left you a personal letter. She asked me to give it to you after we'd discussed the financial details. I took the envelope with hands that were steadier now, though my heart was still racing. Eleanor's handwriting was spidery but elegant, the kind of script they'd taught in schools decades ago. I opened it carefully and began to read.
Whoa!
My dear Maya, the letter began, if you're reading this, then Mr. Morrison has already given you the shocking news about your inheritance. I imagine you're feeling overwhelmed, perhaps even guilty about receiving so much when others have so little. That's exactly why I knew you were the right person for this responsibility. I've watched our family for many years, seen how they treat you with a mixture of pity and condescension that breaks my heart. They mistake your kindness for weakness and your contentment for failure. They don't understand that the most important qualities in life cannot be purchased or displayed or posted on social media for approval. You are the only one who visited your grandmother regularly without making it about yourself. You're the only one who listened to her stories without checking your phone or glancing at your watch. You're the only one who treated her like a person rather than an obligation. That tells me more about your character than any job title or bank balance ever could. This money is not a reward or a prize, it's a tool, and like any tool, its value depends entirely on how it's used. I trust you to use it wisely, not because you're perfect, but because you understand that wealth without character is meaningless. You've already proven you can be happy with little, now you'll have the chance to prove you can be good with much. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for receiving this, and don't let anyone convince you that you don't deserve it. The people who will be most shocked by this news are the same ones who never bothered to really see you in the first place. Their surprise says more about their limitations than yours. Be patient with them, but don't let them diminish you. You've spent too many years being invisible in a family that confused noise with importance. It's time for them to discover who you really are. With love and confidence in your future, Aunt Eleanor. I folded the letter carefully and sat back in the chair, my mind reeling with the implications of what had just happened. In the span of 30 minutes, my entire life had changed. I was no longer Maya the bookstore clerk who rode the bus and shopped at thrift stores. I was Maya the millionaire, with more money than I could comprehend, and more responsibility than I'd ever imagined. The strangest part was how little I felt like celebrating. This wasn't a lottery win, or a stroke of luck, it was a trust placed in me by someone who'd seen something in me that my own family had missed. Eleanor had given me not just money, but validation, confirmation that my choices and values had meaning, even when others dismissed them. Mr. Morrison was gathering up the documents, preparing to end our meeting. I know this is a lot to process, he said kindly. Take your time. The money will be there when you're ready to think about how to use it. In the meantime, try to enjoy the knowledge that someone believed in you enough to entrust you with their life's work. I thanked him and shook his hand, then walked out of the office building into the afternoon sunshine feeling like I was moving through a dream. The city looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. The homeless man on the corner, The business people hurrying past with their phones pressed to their ears, the coffee shop where I sometimes treated myself to a latte on special occasions, all of it looked smaller somehow, less important than it had this morning. I found myself walking instead of heading to the bus stop, needing time to think before I went home to my small apartment that I could now afford to leave, but wasn't sure I wanted to. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was a complete redefinition of who I was and what I was capable of. For years, I'd accepted my family's assessment of my limitations, their assumption that I'd chosen simplicity because I couldn't handle complexity. Now I had the resources to do anything, be anything, go anywhere, and the freedom felt almost overwhelming. But underneath the shock and uncertainty, there was something else growing. A quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with the money itself and everything to do with what it represented. Eleanor had seen past the surface judgments and superficial assessments to recognize something valuable in me. She'd believed I was worthy of this trust when my own family saw me as worthy only of their pity. Tomorrow, Jessica would go to work and continue her performance about her struggling cousin, who couldn't manage to make anything of herself. She'd accept sympathy and praise for her patience with someone so limited, her generous spirit in maintaining family connections despite such obvious differences in drive and capability. She had no idea that while she was explaining my failures to her impressed audience, I was sitting on a fortune that would make her tech salary look like spare change. The irony was delicious, but it was also complicated. This inheritance would change everything between us, everything in our family, everything about how people saw me and treated me, and what they expected from me. Eleanor's letter had warned me to be patient with their surprise, but I wasn't sure I felt patient. I felt powerful, and that was a new sensation that I wasn't entirely comfortable with. I thought about Jessica's coworkers, listening to her explain my limitations while she basked in their admiration for her success and compassion. I thought about Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen, always treating me like the family member who'd never quite lived up to her potential. I thought about all the family gatherings where I'd been invisible, all the conversations that had flowed around me without including me, all the assumptions about my life that had gone unchallenged because I'd never bothered to correct them. Now I had the power to correct all of it, dramatically and permanently. The question was whether I wanted to and how, and what the consequences would be for everyone involved. Eleanor had given me more than money, she'd given me the ability to rewrite the family narrative entirely. Whether I used that power wisely would determine whether I deserved the trust she'd placed in me. For now, though, I just walked through the city, getting used to the weight of secrets and the strange lightness that came with knowing that everything had changed, even if no one else knew it yet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but today I could simply exist in the space between my old life and my new one, carrying Eleanor's faith in me like a precious stone in my pocket. The text from Jessica arrived while I was sitting in my small kitchen, staring at a cup of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. The inheritance papers were spread across my table like evidence of a crime I hadn't committed, each document stamped and official and completely surreal. My phone buzzed against the wooden surface, and Jessica's name appeared on the screen with a message that made my stomach clench. Family brunch Sunday at Riverfront Bistro. 11 a.m. Sophie's treating us to celebrate her new listing. Wear something nice, the place has a dress code, don't be late. No question mark. No, would you like to join us or are you free? Just an assumption that I'd show up when summoned, grateful for the invitation to witness someone else's success. The restaurant she'd chosen was in the heart of downtown, the kind of place where entrees started at $35 and the waitstaff treated you differently based on how expensive your handbag looked. I'd walked past it dozens of times but never considered going inside, not because I couldn't afford it, but because everything about it screamed exclusivity for its own sake. But now, sitting with documents that proved I could buy the entire restaurant without making a significant dent in my inheritance, the invitation felt different. Jessica had no idea that while she was planning to parade me around as her charitable project, I was sitting on enough money to make her monthly salary look like pocket change. She'd chosen this restaurant specifically because she knew it would make me uncomfortable, knew I'd feel out of place among the marble floors and crystal chandeliers and waiters who spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the chef's latest creation. I looked down at my hands, still shaking slightly from the morning's revelation. 3 hours ago, I'd been Maya the bookstore clerk, who counted quarters for lunch money. Now I was Maya the multimillionaire, and I had no idea how to reconcile those two versions of myself. The money felt abstract, like numbers on a screen rather than something real I could touch or use. But the power it represented was very real, especially when it came to family dynamics that had been carved in stone for decades. The rational part of me knew I should follow Mr. Tash, Morrison's advice and keep the inheritance private for now. Eleanor's letter had emphasized patience, understanding that my family's shock would be proportional to how thoroughly they'd misjudged me. But another part of me, a part that had been quietly simmering for years, wanted to see the look on Jessica's face when she realized that her favorite example of failure had just become the wealthiest member of the family. I typed back a simple "I'll be there" and set my phone aside, then walked to my closet to consider what someone worth $85 million should wear to brunch. The irony wasn't lost on me that I now had the resources to buy designer clothes, but genuinely preferred my simple, comfortable wardrobe. The inheritance hadn't changed my taste, it had just made my choices feel more intentional rather than necessary. Sunday morning arrived gray and drizzly, typical Portland weather that made the city feel smaller and more intimate. I chose a navy dress I'd bought at a consignment shop, well-made but unremarkable, paired with the same comfortable flats I'd worn to the lawyer's office. Looking in the mirror, I saw exactly what Jessica would expect to see her cousin who tried her best but never quite managed to look polished or expensive. The difference was that now I knew the appearance was a choice rather than a limitation. Riverfront Bistro occupied the ground floor of a gleaming high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the Willamette River and the bridges that connected East and West Portland. The hostess greeted me with the kind of professional smile that managed to convey both welcome and assessment, her eyes flickering over my outfit with practiced efficiency. I gave Jessica's name, and was led through a dining room filled with people who looked like they'd stepped out of a lifestyle magazine, all carefully curated outfits and conversations about wine pairings and weekend houses. Jessica had claimed a table near the windows, surrounded by the same group from Grandmother's Memorial plus a few additions I didn't recognize. She waved when she saw me approaching, her smile bright and performative as always. "Maya, you made it. I wasn't sure if you'd be comfortable with the prices here, but Sophie insisted on treating everyone." Sophie Williams beamed from across the table, her real estate success having apparently reached new heights worthy of celebration. "I just closed on a $5 million property in the West Hills," she announced to the table at large. "The commission alone is more than most people make in 2 years. I figured it was time to share the wealth a little." The comment was clearly directed at me, accompanied by the kind of smile that suggested she was being generous by including someone who couldn't afford to reciprocate. I thanked her for the invitation and took the seat Jessica had saved for me, noticing that it was positioned to face away from the river view. Even in seating arrangements, I was relegated to the less desirable position. "Maya works at Powell's Books," Jessica explained to the people I hadn't met before, her tone carrying the mixture of affection and pity she'd perfected over the years. "It's this wonderful independent bookstore downtown." She gets to be surrounded by literature all day, which is perfect for someone with her artistic temperament. Not everyone is cut out for the corporate world. David Kim nodded knowingly. That's actually really cool. I bet you get great book recommendations. I've been meaning to read more, but work keeps me so busy. He said this like reading was a luxury hobby rather than something people did naturally, and I could see Jessica filing away his comment as evidence of how much more demanding successful careers were compared to my simple job. The conversation flowed around me as menus were distributed and mimosas were ordered. Jessica held court as usual, regaling the table with stories about her latest marketing campaign and the client dinner she'd attended at a restaurant that required reservations 3 months in advance. She name-dropped colleagues and industry connections with casual precision, building a narrative of success that positioned her as someone moving in increasingly exclusive circles. The networking aspect is really what sets you apart in tech, she was saying to Marcus, who hung on her every word despite being present for most of these stories during their office conversations. It's not enough to be good at your job anymore. You have to understand the industry, build relationships, position yourself strategically for advancement opportunities. Sophie nodded enthusiastically. It's the same in real estate. My clients don't just want someone who can show them houses, they want someone who understands their lifestyle, their aspirations, their long-term investment goals. Success is about emotional intelligence as much as technical skills. I listen to them construct their philosophies of achievement, each story an insight designed to reinforce their positions as people who understood how the world really worked. They talked about success like it was a science they'd mastered, with clear inputs and predictable outputs that separated the winners from everyone else. The underlying assumption was that people like me simply hadn't figured out the formula, or lacked the drive to implement it effectively. When the food arrived, Jessica made a point of explaining various dishes to me, describing ingredients and preparation methods like I was a tourist experiencing fine dining for the first time. The salmon is wild caught from Alaska, she said, cutting into her entree with theatrical precision. And the sauce is made with organic herbs from their rooftop garden. It's incredible how much attention they pay to sourcing here. I thanked her for the explanation and focused on my own meal, a simple pasta dish that cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. The food was excellent, but I found myself thinking about the conversations happening at other tables, wondering how many of these people had inherited their wealth versus earned it, and whether the distinction mattered as much as everyone seemed to think it did. Maya's always been content with simple pleasures, Aunt Carmen observed, appearing beside our table with Uncle Robert in tow. They'd been seated across the restaurant but had come over to say hello, bringing with them the same energy that had dominated family gatherings for years. It's actually quite admirable in a world that's so focused on material success. Uncle Robert nodded sagely. There's something to be said for knowing your limitations and finding happiness within them. Not everyone can be a high achiever, and that's okay. The world needs all kinds of people. Their comments landed like gentle slaps, delivered with such apparent kindness that arguing would have made me seem ungrateful or defensive. This was the family dynamic I'd grown up with, Jessica as the shining example of what was possible with hard work and ambition, and me as the cautionary tale of what happened when someone chose comfort over challenge. They weren't intentionally cruel, they genuinely believed they were being supportive by accepting my limitations and celebrating my ability to find contentment despite them. Jessica beamed at her parents' assessment, clearly pleased to have her success contextualized against my apparent lack thereof. Maya's actually really inspiring in her own way, she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand with practiced warmth. She's proof that happiness doesn't have to come from climbing the corporate ladder or accumulating wealth. Some people find fulfillment in simpler things, The word "some people" hung in the air like a banner, clearly distinguishing between Jessica's category of ambitious achievers and my category of people who'd settled for less. I smiled and nodded, playing my assigned role in their narrative while knowing that in my purse, folded carefully in my wallet, was a bank routing number connected to an account that contained more money than everyone at this table would earn in their lifetimes combined. Sophie raised her mimosa glass in a toast. To different definitions of success, she said with apparent sincerity, and to family that supports each other regardless of different paths in life. Everyone clinked glasses, including me, while I wondered what their definition of support actually meant when it came with such clear hierarchies and assumptions. The conversation shifted to Sophie's new property listing, a mansion in the hills that would apparently set records for the neighborhood if it sold at asking price. She pulled out her phone to show photos of marble countertops and infinity pools, describing the kind of buyers who could afford such luxury with the reverence reserved for discussing royalty or celebrities. The house was beautiful, but there was something performative about her presentation, as if she were using the property to establish her own credibility as someone who moved in rarefied circles. The master suite alone is larger than most people's entire apartments, she was saying, swiping through images of walk-in closets and spa-like bathrooms. And the wine cellar can hold over 1,000 bottles. The current owners are relocating to their estate in Napa, so they're looking for a quick sale. Jessica leaned in to examine the photos more closely. What's the listing price? $4.8 million, Sophie replied with casual precision, which is actually reasonable for the neighborhood and the amenities. Properties like this don't stay on the market long when they're priced correctly. I found myself doing quick mental calculations, realizing that I could afford to buy the house outright without financing, with enough money left over to furnish it completely and still have the vast majority of my inheritance untouched. The thought was surreal, like imagining myself flying or breathing underwater. 6 months ago, 4.8 million had been an abstract number representing wealth I couldn't comprehend. Now it was less than 6% of what I was worth. Marcus whistled softly at the listing price. That's more than I'll make in my entire career probably. It's wild that people have that kind of money just sitting around. Well, that's what happens when you make smart investments and build generational wealth, Jessica said with the authority of someone who'd read articles about financial planning. Most people think short-term, but the really wealthy families think in decades and centuries. They understand compound interest and asset appreciation in ways that regular people don't. The irony of receiving a lecture about generational wealth from someone who had no idea they were sitting across from an actual inheritor of such wealth was almost overwhelming. Jessica spoke about rich people like they were a different species, possessing secret knowledge and superior decision-making abilities that separated them from ordinary folks who lived paycheck to paycheck. She had no idea that the quiet cousin she pitied for working at a bookstore now had access to exactly the kind of generational wealth she was describing. It's also about mindset, Sophie added, clearly enjoying her role as someone who worked with wealthy clients regularly. Rich people think differently about money. They see it as a tool for creating more wealth rather than something to spend on immediate gratification. They invest in assets that appreciate rather than liabilities that depreciate. I listened to them theorize about wealth while I sat there actually wealthy, watching them construct elaborate explanations for success that had nothing to do with the inheritance that had just made me richer than any of them would ever be. Their confidence in their understanding of how money worked was matched only by their ignorance of the fact that I now had more money than they could earn in multiple lifetimes. The meal continued with more stories about professional achievements and expensive purchases, each person taking turns to establish their position in the hierarchy of success. Jessica talked about her plan to upgrade from her current BMW to something more luxurious once her next promotion came through. Sophie mentioned the vacation home she was considering buying in Bend, close enough for weekend trips but far enough to feel like an escape from city life. Even David shared his goal of eventually starting his own consulting firm once he'd saved enough money to handle the financial uncertainty of entrepreneurship. They all spoke about their futures in terms of accumulation and advancement, measuring progress by salary increases and asset acquisition and the expansion of their professional networks. Success was quantifiable, visible, something that could be displayed and admired and used to establish social position. The idea that someone might already possess substantial wealth without displaying it or talking about it seemed completely foreign to their understanding of how rich people behaved. The thing about money, Uncle Robert said, settling into the kind of philosophical tone he adopted when dispensing life wisdom, is that it amplifies who you already are. Good people do good things with wealth, but it can also corrupt people who aren't prepared for that kind of responsibility. Aunt Carmen nodded along. That's why it's probably better that most of us don't have to deal with that kind of pressure. Can you imagine having to manage millions of dollars? The stress would be overwhelming. I almost laughed at that, thinking about the documents spread across my kitchen table, and Mr. Morrison's calm explanations of trust funds and investment portfolios. The inheritance hadn't felt stressful in the way Aunt Carmen described. It had felt surreal, like being handed the keys to a car I didn't know how to drive but would have to learn quickly. The stress came from keeping the secret, from sitting at this table listening to everyone theorize about wealth while I tried to process what it meant to actually possess it. Jessica checked her phone and announced that she needed to leave soon for another engagement, some networking event that would help her career trajectory. The meal was winding down anyway, with people beginning to gather their belongings and exchange pleasantries about staying in touch and planning future get-togethers. Sophie handled the bill with theatrical generosity, making sure everyone understood the magnitude of her treat while simultaneously establishing her financial superiority over the rest of the group. As we prepared to leave, Jessica pulled me aside with the kind of conspiratorial intimacy that suggested she was about to share something important. "I'm really glad you came today," she said, her voice soft with apparent sincerity. "I know places like this can feel intimidating, but it's good for you to see what's possible when you put yourself out there professionally." I thanked her for thinking of me playing my role in the script we'd been following for years. She hugged me goodbye with extra warmth, the kind reserved for charitable acts that made the giver feel virtuous. "Take care of yourself, okay? And remember, if you ever want to talk about career options or ways to improve your situation, I'm always here to help." Walking back to my car in the restaurant's parking garage, I felt the weight of the secret I was carrying like a physical presence in my chest. In a few hours, I would go home to my small apartment and sit with the inheritance documents, trying to understand what Eleanor had entrusted me with and how I was supposed to use it wisely. But first, I had to process what had just happened at that table, the casual dismissal disguised as concern, the assumptions about my limitations presented as acceptance of my choices. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was proof that someone had seen value in me that my own family had missed. Eleanor had looked past the surface judgments and superficial assessments to recognize something worth investing in. She'd believed I could handle responsibility that others assumed I couldn't manage, trusted me with wealth that others thought would corrupt or overwhelm me. Tomorrow, Jessica would go back to her office and tell her co-workers about the family brunch, probably describing how generous Sophie had been to include everyone and how grateful I'd seemed for the opportunity to experience fine dining. She'd use the story to reinforce her narrative about success and failure, about people who reached for more and people who settled for less. She had no idea that while she was explaining my limitations to her impressed audience, I was sitting on a fortune that would make her accomplishments look like practice runs for real success. The knowledge felt powerful and isolating in equal measure, Power because I now had the resources to change everything about my life and my family's assumptions about me. Isolating because I couldn't share the truth with anyone yet, couldn't correct their misunderstandings or defend myself against their pity. I had to carry Eleanor's trust alone until I figured out how to use it responsibly. But as I drove home through the city streets, past coffee shops and bookstores and all the ordinary places that made up my daily life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not for the money itself, but for the moment when my family would finally understand who I really was. Eleanor had given me more than wealth, she'd given me the power to rewrite their story about me entirely. The call came on a Wednesday morning, while I was reorganizing the poetry section at Powell's, my hands covered in dust from moving volumes of Neruda and Dickinson to make room for new arrivals. My phone buzzed against my apron pocket, and Jessica's name flashed on the screen with an urgency that made my stomach drop. It had been 3 weeks since the brunch, 3 weeks of carrying Eleanor's secret like a stone in my chest, and I'd started to wonder if I could keep it hidden forever. "Maya, you need to get to Morrison Law Offices immediately." Jessica's voice was sharp, breathless, the kind of tone she used when something had disrupted her carefully controlled world. "There's been some kind of mistake with Great Aunt Eleanor's estate. They're saying I'm not listed as a beneficiary, but that's impossible. She loved our whole family equally." I set down the book I'd been holding, a collection of Maya Angelou poems that seemed suddenly prophetic. "What do you mean, a mistake?" "The lawyer called this morning asking about my relationship to Eleanor Chen, like he was verifying something. He wouldn't tell me details over the phone, just said all beneficiaries needed to be present for the final reading. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen are already on their way. This is probably just some procedural thing, but we need to make sure the paperwork is correct." Her assumption that we were all beneficiaries, that Eleanor's wealth would be distributed equally among family members according to some imagined fairness, revealed how little she'd actually known our great aunt. Eleanor had been careful about everything, deliberate in her choices, someone who thought deeply before acting. The idea that she would scatter her fortune randomly among relatives she rarely saw demonstrated exactly the kind of shallow thinking that had led Eleanor to choose me instead. "I can be there in an hour," I said, already untying my apron. My manager looked up from the register with concern, and I mouthed family emergency while Jessica continued talking about inheritance laws and proper documentation and the importance of having legal representation present during estate proceedings. "This is exactly why wealthy people hire estate planning attorneys," she was saying, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she used when explaining things she'd Googled 5 minutes earlier. "There are so many ways for things to go wrong when large sums of money are involved. Probate court, tax implications, contested wills. It's incredibly complex." I almost told her then that there was nothing complex about Eleanor's will, that it was straightforward and legally airtight, and had already been executed exactly as she'd intended. But something held me back, maybe the memory of her voice at the brunch describing my limitations to a table full of people who nodded along sympathetically. Let her think this was a bureaucratic error that her superior understanding of legal matters could resolve. Morrison Law Offices felt different this time, charged with an energy that hadn't been present during my private meeting. The same receptionist who'd looked confused by my appearance 3 weeks earlier now greeted me with professional warmth, as if my financial status had somehow become visible in the way I carried myself. I was wearing the same navy dress, the same comfortable flats, but everything felt different now that I knew what the numbers in my bank account actually meant. Jessica arrived 10 minutes later in a flurry of designer perfume and clicking heels, followed closely by Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen, who looked appropriately somber for what they assumed was a formal legal proceeding. Jessica had dressed for the occasion in a sharp black suit that probably cost more than I made in a month at the bookstore, her hair pulled back in the kind of severe bun that suggested she meant business. She carried a leather portfolio and wore the expression of someone prepared to advocate fiercely for her rightful inheritance. "Here," she said, kissing my cheek with practiced efficiency, "I brought copies of all our family documentation, just in case there are questions about bloodlines or legal relationships. Uncle Robert has the family genealogy charts, and Aunt Carmen brought photos of Eleanor at family gatherings to prove how close we all were." The preparation was impressive and completely unnecessary, like bringing a calculator to solve a problem that had already been answered. I watched them arrange their evidence of worthiness, while knowing that Eleanor had made her decision based on qualities that couldn't be documented or photographed or proven with genealogy charts. She'd chosen character over connection, depth over surface relationships, someone who'd earned her trust through years of quiet kindness, rather than people who showed up now expecting reward for genetic proximity. Mr. Morrison appeared in the waiting area precisely on time, his silver hair impeccable, and his expression carefully neutral. He shook hands with each family member, his greeting warm but professional, giving no indication of what was about to unfold. "Thank you all for coming. I know this is difficult timing so soon after Eleanor's passing, but estate matters require prompt attention." He led us into the same conference room where I'd learned about my inheritance, but it felt completely different with 4 people instead of 1. The massive table that had seemed intimidating during my solo meeting now felt appropriately sized for what was clearly going to be a dramatic conversation. Jessica took the seat at the head of the table like she was chairing a board meeting, with Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen flanking her in positions that suggested solidarity. I sat across from them, suddenly feeling like I was facing a tribunal. "Before we begin, Mr. Morrison said, opening the thick folder that contained Eleanor's complete estate documentation, "I want to clarify the purpose of today's meeting. This is not a reading of the will in the traditional sense. Eleanor Chen's will was quite specific and has already been executed according to her wishes. Today is about addressing questions that have arisen regarding the estate distribution." Jessica leaned forward, her portfolio open and pen poised like she was taking minutes. "We understand there may have been some confusion about beneficiaries. I'm Jessica Rodriguez, Eleanor's great-niece, and these are my parents, Robert and Carmen Chen Rodriguez. We're here to clarify our relationship to the deceased and ensure proper distribution according to intestacy laws." Morrison's expression remained neutral, but I caught the slightest twitch at the corner of his mouth. "Miss Rodriguez, there's no confusion about beneficiaries. Eleanor's will is extremely clear about her intentions. The purpose of this meeting is to address inquiries from family members who seem to believe they were entitled to inherit portions of the estate." The word "entitled" landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of discomfort across the table. Uncle Robert cleared his throat and spoke with the measured tone he used for important family discussions. "Eleanor was family. We maintained regular contact with her over the years, included her in holiday celebrations, treated her as a beloved relative. While we're not expecting anything specific, it would be unusual for someone to exclude immediate family members from their estate planning." "How regular was this contact?" Mr. Morrison asked, consulting his notes. "According to Eleanor's records, she received Christmas cards from your family annually, but the last time she saw any of you in person was at a family reunion 6 years ago. Is that accurate?" Aunt Carmen shifted uncomfortably. Eleanor was somewhat reclusive in her later years. We respected her privacy and didn't want to impose on her solitude. But family bonds transcend physical visits. She knew we cared about her. "I'm sure she did," Mr. Morrison replied diplomatically. "However, Eleanor's will was based on her personal relationships and individual preferences, not family obligations or genetic proximity. She was very specific about her reasoning for her distribution choices." Jessica's pen had stopped moving, and her confident posture was beginning to deflate slightly. Are you saying she left everything to charity? Because that would be unexpected. Eleanor always seemed to value family connections. No, Miss Rodriguez. Eleanor did not leave her estate to charity, she left it to a family member. Mr. Morrison turned to look directly at me. Maya, would you like to explain, or shall I? The moment stretched between us like a bridge I could choose to cross or burn. Jessica's eyes followed Mr. Morrison's gaze to my face, and I watched comprehension dawn slowly, like sunrise breaking over mountains. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed, then opened again without producing sound. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen looked confused, still processing what they'd just heard. Eleanor left her entire estate to me, I said quietly, $85 million. The will was executed 3 weeks ago. The silence that followed was absolute. Jessica stared at me like I'd just announced I was moving to Mars, her carefully constructed worldview crumbling in real time. Uncle Robert blinked several times, as if clearing his vision might change what he'd heard. Aunt Carmen made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a cough. That's impossible, Jessica said finally, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. 85 million. Eleanor lived in a tiny house, drove an old car, dressed like she shopped at thrift stores. She couldn't have had that kind of money. Mr. Morrison slid a document across the table. Eleanor Chen was an early investor in Cascade Software, which became one of the Pacific Northwest's most successful tech companies. She also inherited significant real estate holdings from her late husband and made conservative investments that appreciated substantially over 4 decades. She was worth approximately $85.3 million at the time of her death. Jessica picked up the document with shaking hands, scanning numbers that were too large for her brain to process. But why Maya? I mean, no offense, Maya, but you work part-time at a bookstore. You live in a studio apartment and take the bus everywhere. What could you possibly do with this kind of money? The question revealed everything about how she saw me, how she'd always seen me. In Jessica's mind, wealth should go to people who already looked successful, who had demonstrated their ability to manage money by accumulating visible symbols of prosperity. The idea that someone living simply might be capable of handling great wealth contradicted everything she believed about merit and reward. Eleanor's letter explains her reasoning, Mr. Morrison said, producing the envelope I'd read 3 weeks earlier. She left specific instructions about why she chose Maya as her sole beneficiary. I watched Jessica's face as Mr. Morrison read Eleanor's words aloud, her explanation of character over credentials, of kindness over accomplishments, of someone who understood that the most important qualities in life couldn't be purchased or displayed. Each sentence hit Jessica like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the gap between her self-perception and Eleanor's assessment of her worthiness. She visited your grandmother every week for 3 years, Mr. Morrison read. She listened to stories without checking her phone, helped with groceries without being asked, remembered birthdays without expecting recognition. She treated your grandmother like a person rather than an obligation, which tells me more about her character than any resume ever could. Uncle Robert was studying the estate documents like they might reveal some loophole or error that would restore the natural order of things. This is a significant responsibility for someone so young. Are there provisions for financial management, investment oversight, that sort of thing? Eleanor arranged for comprehensive financial advisory services, Mr. Morrison replied, but the money belongs to Maya unconditionally. She can use it however she sees fit. Jessica was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock and something that might have been fear. For years, she'd used my modest lifestyle as proof of her own superiority, evidence that she was the family member who'd figured out how to succeed. Now that narrative was completely destroyed, replaced by the realization that while she'd been congratulating herself on her achievements, I'd quietly inherited more wealth than she could earn in multiple lifetimes. What are you going to do with it? Aunt Carmen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That's an enormous amount of money. I thought about Eleanor's letter, her emphasis on using wealth as a tool rather than a trophy. I'm still figuring that out. Eleanor left suggestions about charitable causes she cared about, but the decisions are mine to make. Charitable causes, Jessica repeated, like the words tasted strange in her mouth. You're going to give it away. Some of it, probably. Eleanor believed in using money to make a positive difference, not just accumulate more wealth for its own sake. I was thinking out loud, processing ideas that had been forming over the past 3 weeks. I'm also considering funding educational programs, maybe scholarship opportunities for students who wouldn't otherwise have access to higher education. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. Jessica, who'd spent years lecturing me about the importance of ambition and professional achievement, was now listening to me discuss philanthropic strategies worth more than she'd ever imagined possible. The cousin she'd pitied for working at a bookstore was now in a position to fund entire university programs. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, attempting to regain some semblance of family authority. Of course, decisions of this magnitude shouldn't be made hastily. Perhaps we could arrange for some family consultations, ensure that Eleanor's money is used in ways that would honor her memory appropriately. The suggestion was politely worded, but transparently motivated by their desire to influence how I used wealth they'd expected to inherit themselves. I could see them already calculating percentages, imagining advisory roles that would give them access to resources they felt they deserved by virtue of genetic connection. Eleanor was very clear that these decisions belonged to Maya alone. Mr. Morrison interjected smoothly. The will contains no provisions for family oversight or consultation requirements. Maya is the sole executor and beneficiary with complete discretionary authority. Jessica finally found her voice again, though it sounded strained and artificial. Well, congratulations, Maya. This is obviously unexpected. I'm sure you'll do something meaningful with Eleanor's gift. She was trying to sound supportive, but every word felt forced, like she was reading from a script written in a language she didn't speak fluently. The meeting concluded with handshakes and promises to stay in touch, but the family dynamic had shifted permanently. As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave, I could feel them looking at me differently, recalculating my worth based on new information they were still struggling to process. I was no longer the family member who needed their patience and sympathy. I was someone whose financial decisions could impact their own lives in ways they were just beginning to understand. Jessica lingered after her parents left, ostensibly to exchange contact information, but really to have a private conversation about what had just happened. We stood in the marble lobby of the law office building, afternoon sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, while she struggled to find words for a situation she'd never imagined. I have to ask, she said finally, her voice quieter than usual. When did you find out? About the inheritance, I mean. 3 weeks ago, the day after the memorial service. She processed this information, realizing that I'd known about my wealth during the brunch at Riverfront Bistro, had sat quietly while she explained my limitations to a table full of people who nodded along sympathetically. The memory of that conversation clearly embarrassed her now, though she was trying to hide her discomfort behind a facade of casual curiosity. So when we were at brunch and I was talking about, I mean, if I said anything that seemed, she trailed off, unable to complete the sentence without acknowledging how condescending she'd been. You didn't know. I said simply. None of you did. But you could have said something. You could have corrected us when we were making assumptions about your situation. There was a hint of accusation in her voice, as if I'd been deliberately deceiving them, rather than simply keeping private information private. Eleanor asked me to wait 6 months before telling anyone. She wanted me to have time to adjust without outside pressure. It was true, though not the complete truth. Part of me had enjoyed watching them reveal their assumptions about worth and success, listening to them theorize about wealth while I sat there actually wealthy. Jessica nodded like this made perfect sense, though I could see her mind working to reframe the past 3 weeks in light of this new information. Well, I suppose that makes sense. This kind of news would definitely attract attention you might not want. We said goodbye with awkward hugs and promises to talk soon, both of us knowing that our relationship had fundamentally changed. I was no longer someone she needed to help or include out of familial obligation. I was someone whose resources exceeded her own by margins she couldn't comprehend. The power dynamic we'd maintained for years had inverted completely, and neither of us was sure how to navigate the new reality. Walking to my car in the parking garage, I felt a strange mixture of relief and melancholy. The secret was out, at least within the family, and I no longer had to carry Eleanor's trust alone, but I also understood that my relationships with Jessica, Uncle Robert, and Aunt Carmen would never be the same. They would always wonder now what I thought of their assumptions about my life, their casual dismissal of my choices, their certainty that success looked like their version of achievement. The inheritance hadn't just given me financial freedom, it had given me the power to redefine how my family saw me, and how I saw myself. Eleanor's letter had been right about the importance of character over credentials, of kindness over accomplishments. She'd recognized something valuable in me that my own family had missed, and her trust had validated choices I'd sometimes questioned myself. Driving home through the city I'd lived in my entire life, I thought about all the possibilities that lay ahead. I could travel anywhere, buy anything, support causes I believed in, create opportunities for others that hadn't existed before. But underneath the excitement of infinite options was a deeper satisfaction that had nothing to do with money itself. Eleanor had seen me clearly when others saw only limitations, had believed in my worthiness when others assumed my contentment meant settling for less. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, surrounded by the same furniture and belongings I'd had that morning, but everything felt different now that the secret was shared. My phone buzzed with text messages from Jessica and my aunt and uncle, carefully worded notes about staying connected and looking forward to future conversations. I could read between the lines, their hope that my newfound wealth might benefit them in some way, that family relationships might translate into financial opportunities. But I also received a call from my manager at Powell's, checking to make sure everything was okay after my emergency departure. Her genuine concern for my well-being, with no ulterior motive or hidden agenda, reminded me why Eleanor had valued authenticity over advancement. The people who cared about me when I had nothing were the ones who deserved consideration now that I had everything. Eleanor's inheritance wasn't just money. It was a test of character, a challenge to use resources wisely and remain true to values that couldn't be purchased. As I read her letter one more time that night, I understood that she'd given me more than wealth. She'd given me the opportunity to prove that her faith in me was justified, to honor her memory by becoming the person she'd believed I could be. The inheritance would change many things about my life, but it wouldn't change who I was at my core. I was still Maya who loved books and quiet conversations, who found contentment in simple pleasures and meaning in small kindness. I was just Maya with resources now, Maya with the power to make Eleanor's values visible in a world that often confused wealth with worth. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, questions about how to use money responsibly and maintain relationships that had been redefined defined by circumstance. But tonight, I could simply sit with the knowledge that someone had seen my worth when others saw only limitations, had trusted me with their life's work when others assumed I couldn't handle responsibility. Eleanor's inheritance was more than financial security. It was validation that character mattered more than credentials, that kindness was worth more than accomplishment, that the quiet strength I'd always possessed was exactly what she'd been looking for in choosing her heir. The money would allow me to do good in the world, but her faith in me had already changed everything that truly mattered. 6 months had passed since the revelation at Morrison Law offices, and the changes in my life had been both dramatic and surprisingly subtle. I still lived in the same apartment in Hawthorne, still worked part-time at Powell's Books, still preferred comfortable clothes to designer labels. But underneath the familiar routines, everything was different. The inheritance had given me something more valuable than money: the freedom to choose my life deliberately, rather than accept it by default. The first major decision had been about the bookstore. Within a week of learning about Eleanor's estate, I'd quietly purchased the building that housed Powell's, ensuring that this Portland institution would never face the threat of rising rents or corporate buyouts that had claimed so many independent bookstores across the country. I'd done it anonymously through a trust, with the only stipulation being that the space would permanently house a community-focused bookstore, with fair wages for all employees. My manager, Sarah, had noticed the improvement in my demeanor even before she learned about the building purchase. "You seem different lately," she'd observed one afternoon as we shelved new arrivals in the fiction section. "More confident, somehow. Like you figured something out that was bothering you before." She was right, though I couldn't explain that what I'd figured out was how to stop apologizing for being content with what others considered insufficient. The inheritance hadn't made me ambitious in the traditional sense, but it had made me intentional about supporting the things I valued: literature, community spaces, education, and the kind of quiet kindness that Eleanor had recognized in me. Jessica had struggled more obviously with the new reality. Our first conversation after the lawyer's office had been stilted and strange, with her alternating between attempts at normalcy and barely concealed requests for financial advice. She'd started sentences about investment strategies and philanthropic tax benefits, then caught herself and tried to pivot to casual family small talk. The performance was exhausting for both of us. "I've been thinking about what Eleanor wrote in her letter," she'd said during one particularly awkward phone call, "about recognizing character and valuing the right things. I wonder if I've been too focused on career advancement and not enough on personal relationships." The words sounded rehearsed, like she'd been practicing a speech about newfound humility. I'd listened patiently while she reconstructed herself as someone who'd always secretly valued the same qualities Eleanor had praised. Someone who'd simply been misunderstood as materialistic when she was actually deeply spiritual. It was painful to watch her rewrite her own history to align with what she thought I wanted to hear, as if my inheritance had given me the power to judge her character and find it wanting. The truth was more complicated. Jessica wasn't a bad person. She was someone who'd been shaped by a culture that equated worth with wealth, success with visibility, importance with acquisition. She genuinely believed she was helping me by encouraging more ambition, more striving, more desire for the kind of life she'd built for herself. Learning that I'd inherited more money than she could imagine forced her to question not just her assumptions about me, but her entire worldview about merit and reward. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen had responded differently, with a kind of wounded dignity that suggested they felt deceived rather than simply surprised. At a family dinner, 2 months after the revelation, Aunt Carmen had made pointed comments about the responsibility that came with inherited wealth, the importance of seeking guidance from experienced family members, the dangers of making hasty decisions without proper consultation. Eleanor was brilliant with investments. Obviously, she'd said while passing the mashed potatoes. But she wasn't particularly social. She might not have fully understood the complexities of managing wealth within a family system. These decisions affect everyone, not just the person who technically inherited the money. The word technically had hung in the air like smoke, suggesting that my legal ownership of Eleanor's estate was somehow less valid than the moral claim they felt they possessed as family members. Uncle Robert had nodded along, adding his own observations about the importance of preserving family harmony and considering the broader implications of financial choices. They weren't wrong about the complexity, but they were wrong about the solution. Eleanor hadn't chosen me despite my lack of experience with wealth. She'd chosen me because of my values, my character, my demonstrated ability to care about things that mattered more than money. The inheritance wasn't a mistake that required correction by more financially sophisticated relatives. It was a deliberate choice by someone who'd observed our family for decades and made her decision accordingly. The conversation that had finally cleared the air between Jessica and me had happened unexpectedly during a chance encounter at a coffee shop in Southeast Portland. I'd been reading in a corner booth when she'd walked in, apparently meeting someone for a business discussion that had fallen through at the last minute. Instead of leaving, she'd approached my table with the kind of tentative smile that suggested she was genuinely unsure of her reception. "Mind if I sit?" she'd asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from me. "I know things have been weird between us lately, and I hate that. We're family, you know." I'd closed my book and nodded toward the chair, curious to see where the conversation would lead. Jessica had ordered an elaborate latte and spent several minutes arranging her phone and purse and jacket like she was preparing for a presentation. When she finally looked up, her expression was more vulnerable than I'd seen since we were children. "I need to be honest with you about something," she'd said, her voice quieter than usual. "Finding out about your inheritance didn't just surprise me, it scared me. Not because I thought I deserved Eleanor's money, but because it made me realize how wrong I've been about everything." I'd waited for her to continue, sensing that this conversation was important in ways that went beyond our family dynamics. I built my entire sense of self around being the successful one, the one who figured out how to make it in the world, while others struggled or settled for less. When I talked about you to my friends or coworkers, I used your situation as proof of my own achievements. Not intentionally cruel, but definitely condescending. I was using your life to make mine look better. The admission was both painful and relieving. I'd known this, of course, had felt it in every interaction where she'd positioned herself as the helper and me as the project. But hearing her acknowledge it directly removed the pretense that had made our conversations so exhausting. "When I found out you'd inherited $85 million, my first thought wasn't happiness for you or surprise about Eleanor's wealth. It was panic that I'd been wrong about everything, that the person I'd been pitying was actually more successful than I could ever be. It forced me to look at my own motivations in ways that weren't very flattering." Jessica had paused to sip her latte, gathering courage for whatever she planned to say next. "I realized I've been performing success instead of actually living it. The expensive clothes, the fancy restaurants, the constant social media updates about my achievements. It was all about proving my worth to other people rather than being satisfied with what I'd accomplished. I was so busy trying to look successful that I forgot to think about what success actually meant to me personally. It was the most honest conversation we'd ever had, and I found myself genuinely moved by her willingness to examine her own behavior so critically. The Jessica I'd grown up with had always been confident to the point of arrogance, certain that her way of moving through the world was not only correct, but superior to alternatives. This version, uncertain and self-reflective, was someone I could actually connect with. Eleanor's letter mentioned that you visited grandmother every week. Jessica had continued. I didn't even know that. I thought my holiday visits and birthday cards were sufficient. That showing up for the big occasions was what family commitment looked like. I never considered that maybe the small, consistent gestures mattered more than the dramatic ones. I'd thought about all those Saturday afternoons with grandmother, reading to her from library books, listening to stories about her childhood, helping her organize photo albums that no one else seemed interested in. Those visits hadn't felt like charity or obligation. They'd felt like time well spent with someone who appreciated my company. The fact that Eleanor had noticed and valued those interactions suggested she understood something about love that the rest of our family had missed. I want to do better, Jessica had said, leaning forward across the small table. Not because you have money now, but because I realized I've been living according to other people's definitions of success instead of my own. I want to figure out what actually matters to me, not what looks impressive on social media. That conversation had marked the beginning of a different relationship between us, one based on honesty rather than performance. Jessica had started therapy to explore her relationship with achievement and validation, and she'd begun making changes in her life that prioritized substance over appearance. She'd turned down a promotion that would have required longer hours and constant travel, choosing instead to focus on projects that genuinely interested her, rather than ones that would look best on her resume. The changes weren't dramatic or sudden, but they
were real. She'd started volunteering at a literacy program on weekends, teaching adults who'd never learned to read properly. She'd stopped posting constantly on social media, sharing only things that felt meaningful rather than impressive. She'd even reached out to grandmother more frequently, calling just to chat rather than waiting for obligatory holiday check-ins. It's strange, she'd told me, during one of our new, more honest conversations. I always thought I was ambitious, but I think I was just insecure. All that striving and accumulating and performing, it was about proving I was worthy of respect rather than actually respecting myself. Meanwhile, I'd been learning my own lessons about the responsibility that came with Eleanor's trust. The money itself was almost abstract, numbers and accounts managed by financial advisors who understood investment strategies far better than I ever would. But the power to make meaningful change was very real, and figuring out how to use it wisely required more thought than I'd initially anticipated. I'd started small, with donations to causes Eleanor had mentioned in her letter, literacy programs, environmental conservation, scholarships for first-generation college students. Each decision required research and consideration, making sure the organizations were legitimate and effective, that the money would be used in ways that aligned with Eleanor's values and my own understanding of what mattered. The scholarship program had become my most involved project. Working with the financial advisors Eleanor had arranged, I'd established an endowment that would provide full college funding for students from families like mine, not poor enough for maximum financial aid, not wealthy enough to pay without sacrifice,
Caught in the middle where education felt like an impossible luxury, the first recipients would start college in the fall, 12 young people who could now pursue degrees without accumulating crushing debt or working multiple jobs to afford tuition. Each scholarship recipient had to write an essay about their goals and values, but not in the traditional sense of listing achievements or explaining why they deserved financial assistance. Instead, I'd ask them to describe a time when they'd helped someone without expecting recognition, when they'd chosen kindness over convenience, when they'd demonstrated the kind of character that couldn't be measured by grades or test scores. Eleanor's influence was evident in those selection criteria, her belief that the most important qualities were often the most invisible. The application process had attracted hundreds of responses, and reading through them had been both heartbreaking and inspiring. So many young people had stories of caring for elderly relatives, supporting younger siblings, volunteering in their communities despite their own financial struggles. They were Eleanor's people, the ones who understood that worth wasn't measured by accumulation, but by contribution. One essay that had particularly moved me came from a 17-year-old named Marcus, whose grandmother had dementia. He'd spent his high school years helping his mother care for her, reading to her when she couldn't remember his name, helping her with basic tasks while his friends were at parties or football games. His grades were good but not exceptional, his extracurricular activities limited by family responsibilities that left little time for resume-building activities. People sometimes ask me if I resent having to help take care of grandma, he'd written. They assume it's a burden that's keeping me from having a normal teenage experience. But the truth is, those hours sitting with her, reading aloud from her favorite books, listening to stories about her childhood, they've taught me more about what matters in life than any class or club ever could. She may not remember my name anymore, but she still smiles when I walk into the room, and that's worth more than any achievement I could put on a college application. Reading Marcus's essay, I'd understood more clearly what Eleanor had seen in me, why she'd chosen someone who valued time over advancement, relationship over achievement. Marcus would receive one of the scholarships, and I suspected he'd use his education not just to better his own circumstances, but to continue caring for people who needed it. The scholarship program had also taught me about the strange social dynamics of philanthropy. Word had somehow gotten out that I was the anonymous donor behind the endowment, despite my efforts to keep the funding source private. Suddenly, I'd started receiving invitations to charity galas and fundraising events, requests for meetings with development officers from various organizations, phone calls from wealth management firms wanting to discuss strategic giving opportunities. It was exhausting and educational in equal measure. Many of the people reaching out were genuine advocates for important causes, but others seemed more interested in the prestige of association with a major donor than in the actual impact of charitable work. I'd learned to distinguish between organizations that wanted my money and those that shared my values, between people who saw me as an opportunity and those who saw me as a partner in work that mattered. The most rewarding aspect of managing Eleanor's legacy had been the quiet impact that happened without recognition or publicity. The anonymous donation that kept the community center's after-school program running for another year, the scholarship that allowed a single mother to finish her nursing degree, the grant that funded a mobile library serving rural communities where books were scarce. These weren't the kinds of gifts that generated press releases or naming opportunities, but they were the ones that felt most aligned with Eleanor's spirit. Jessica had asked me once if I missed my old life, the simplicity of working at the bookstore without the complexity of managing significant wealth. The question had made me think about what had actually changed and what had remained constant. I still loved books, still found peace in quiet moments, still valued authentic relationships over impressive networking opportunities. The inheritance had given me resources to support the things I cared about, but it hadn't changed what I cared about in the first place. I think Eleanor knew this wouldn't corrupt me or change who I am fundamentally. I'd told Jessica. She trusted that I'd use the money as a tool for good, rather than as a way to buy status or comfort. That trust is more valuable than the actual dollars in the account. The most unexpected consequence of the inheritance had been the way it changed how I saw myself. For years, I'd internalized my family's assumptions about my limitations, their belief that contentment meant settling, that modest ambitions reflected modest capabilities. Eleanor's choice had validated a different way of measuring worth, one based on character rather than credentials, contribution rather than accumulation. I'd stopped apologizing for my choices, stopped feeling defensive about prioritizing meaning over money, relationships over recognition. When people asked what I did for work, I no longer felt compelled to explain or justify my part-time schedule at the bookstore. I worked there because I loved it, and that was reason enough. The inheritance had given me the freedom to choose my life deliberately, rather than accept other people's definitions of success. The bookstore had become a kind of community center, hosting reading groups and poetry nights, providing a gathering space for people who shared Eleanor's values of literature and learning. I'd quietly funded a program that brought authors to speak with local book clubs, subsidized the cost of hosting events for organizations that couldn't afford venue rentals, created a lending library of books and languages spoken by Portland's immigrant communities. None of these initiatives generated publicity or recognition, but they created the kind of impact Eleanor would have appreciated: quiet, meaningful, focused on connection rather than attention. The money she'd left me wasn't just financial capital, it was social capital, the ability to make things happen without needing credit or acknowledgement. A year after the inheritance, I'd received a letter from one of the scholarship recipients, Marcus, the young man who'd cared for his grandmother with dementia. He was thriving in his pre-med program, but more importantly, he was volunteering at a memory care facility, reading to patients whose families couldn't visit regularly. His letter had described the joy he found in these visits, the way literature could reach people even when other forms of communication failed. "I think about your grandmother sometimes when I'm reading to the patients here," he'd written. "How lucky she was to have someone who cared enough to spend time with her regularly, who understood that presence is sometimes more valuable than presence. I hope I can be that kind of person for others who need it." Reading Marcus's letter, I'd understood that Eleanor's legacy was multiplying in ways she might not have anticipated, but would certainly have appreciated. The scholarship hadn't just funded his education, it had validated his values, encouraged him to continue caring for people who might otherwise be forgotten or overlooked. Her investment in my character was generating returns in the lives of people she'd never met but would have loved. Jessica had been right when she'd said that finding out about my inheritance had forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about success and failure, worth and achievement. But the same was true for me. Eleanor's trust had challenged me to think more deeply about responsibility and stewardship, about the difference between having money and using it wisely. The inheritance had taught me that wealth without purpose was meaningless, that the ability to make a difference came with the obligation to actually do so. Eleanor hadn't just given me financial security, she'd given me the opportunity to prove that her faith in my character was justified, to honor her memory by becoming the person she'd believed I could be. 6 months after the lawyer's office revelation, I'd run into Sophie Williams at a coffee shop downtown. She'd approached with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested she'd heard about my change in circumstances and wanted to re-establish our connection. Her real estate business was thriving, she'd explained, and she'd been thinking about our conversation at the brunch about different definitions of success. "I have to admit, I completely misjudged your situation," she'd said with apparent sincerity. "I thought you were someone who'd settled for less when you were actually someone who'd chosen more, just not in ways that were immediately visible. That takes a different kind of courage than what I'm used to seeing." The conversation had been pleasant but brief. Sophie was still measuring success by accumulation and advancement, still focused on building wealth and status in ways that would have impressed Jessica's old value system. We simply lived in different worlds now, with different priorities and different definitions of what mattered most. That evening, I'd sat in my apartment reading one of Eleanor's favorite books, a collection of essays about the importance of paying attention to small beauties in daily life. The inheritance had changed my circumstances dramatically, but it hadn't changed my fundamental nature. I was still someone who found profound meaning in quiet moments, in good books, in authentic relationships with people who valued character over credentials. Eleanor's gift hadn't been just money, it had been validation that this way of being in the world was not only acceptable, but valuable, worth investing in and supporting. She'd seen something in me that my own family had missed, recognized qualities that couldn't be measured by traditional metrics of success. The inheritance would continue to shape my life in ways I was still discovering, but it had already accomplished something more important than financial security. It had given me the confidence to live according to my own values rather than other people's expectations, to measure my worth by my contribution rather than my accumulation. Eleanor's legacy lived on not just in the money she'd left me, but in the understanding that the most important things in life, kindness, compassion, authenticity, love, couldn't be purchased, but could be supported, nurtured, and shared. Her trust in me had become my trust in others, her faith in character over credentials had become my own approach to evaluating what mattered most. As I turned the pages of her book that night, I thought about all the lives that would be touched by her generosity, scholarship recipients who could pursue education without financial stress, community programs that could continue serving people who needed them, quiet acts of kindness that would ripple outward in ways we might never fully measure or understand. The inheritance had changed everything and nothing at all. I was still Maya, who loved books and valued relationships, who found meaning in small gestures and authentic connections. I was just Maya with resources now, Maya with the power to make Eleanor's values visible in a world that too often confused wealth with worth, achievement with character, success with accumulation. Eleanor had given me more than money, she'd given me the opportunity to prove that her faith in me was justified, to honor her memory by using her legacy to create the kind of world she'd believed was possible. That responsibility was both humbling and inspiring, a daily reminder that the most important inheritance wasn't financial but moral, the obligation to use whatever resources we have in service of what matters most. 2 years had transformed everything in ways both profound and beautifully ordinary. The scholarship program I'd established in Eleanor's memory now supported 43 students across 7 universities, each one chosen not for their test scores or achievements, but for their demonstrated compassion and quiet strength. Marcus had become something of an unofficial ambassador for the program, writing letters to new recipients and sharing his experience of how education could amplify existing kindness rather than simply create career opportunities. The community center where I'd begun volunteering had expanded its after-school programs to include a reading initiative for children whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't afford tutoring. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, I would sit in a circle with 8-year-olds who were learning that books could be doorways to worlds beyond their immediate circumstances. Their excitement over discovering new stories reminded me daily why Eleanor had valued education as liberation rather than just advancement. Jessica had undergone her own quiet revolution. Her therapy sessions had led to insights about perfectionism and performance that changed not just her relationship with success, but her relationship with herself. She'd left the tech company where she'd spent years climbing ladders that led nowhere she actually wanted to go, and had started working for a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated individuals develop job skills. The pay was substantially less than her previous salary, but she glowed with a satisfaction I'd never seen during her corporate years. "I finally understand what you and Eleanor knew all along," she'd told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings that had replaced the awkward family obligations of the past. That work should be about contribution, not just compensation. I was so busy trying to prove I was successful that I forgot to think about whether my success meant anything beyond my bank balance. The most unexpected development had been the relationship between Jessica and some of the scholarship recipients. She'd volunteered to mentor several of them, sharing practical advice about navigating college and career decisions while learning from their perspectives on service and community engagement. One student, Maria, had taught Jessica basic Spanish so she could better communicate with clients at the nonprofit. Another, James, had introduced her to urban gardening, and they now maintained a small plot at the community center where children could learn about growing food. These connections had enriched Jessica's life in ways her previous networking events never had. Instead of collecting business cards from people who might advance her career, she was building genuine relationships with individuals whose resilience and wisdom challenged her assumptions about education, opportunity, and success. She'd begun to understand that mentorship was a two-way street, that she had as much to learn from these young people as they had to gain from her professional experience. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen had eventually found their own peace with Eleanor's decision, though their adjustment had taken longer and followed a different path. They'd initially struggled with what they perceived as unfairness, spending months analyzing Eleanor's motivations and questioning whether I truly understood the magnitude of responsibility that came with such wealth. But time and observation had gradually shifted their perspective. The turning point had come when I'd invited them to visit one of the scholarship recipients, a young woman named Angela, who was studying to become a social worker. Angela lived with her grandmother in a small apartment where she cared for the elderly woman while maintaining a full course load and working part-time at a grocery store. During the visit, Aunt Carmen had watched Angela patiently help her grandmother with medication, reading aloud from a romance novel while preparing dinner, and had seen echoes of my own visits with our grandmother years earlier. "I think I understand now why Eleanor chose you," Aunt Carmen had said quietly as we drove home from Angela's apartment. She wasn't just looking at who needed money or who could manage money, she was looking at who understood that taking care of people is more valuable than taking care of investments. Uncle Robert had nodded slowly. Eleanor always said that character was more important than capability, but I thought she was being sentimental. Now I see that she was being practical. Money is a tool, and tools should go to people who will use them for the right purposes. Their acceptance had removed the last barrier to genuine family harmony. We still gathered for holidays and celebrations, but the dynamic had shifted from subtle competition to authentic connection. Jessica no longer felt the need to perform her achievements. Uncle Robert and Aunt Carmen no longer treated me like a charity case, and I no longer felt defensive about my choices or apologetic for my contentment. The bookstore had become the unofficial headquarters for several community initiatives. Sarah, my former manager who now co-owned the building through a cooperative agreement I'd arranged, had expanded programming to include financial literacy workshops for immigrants, creative writing groups for teenagers, and monthly discussions about social justice literature. The space hummed with activity and purpose in ways that made Eleanor's investment feel multiplied rather than simply spent. One afternoon, while reorganizing the poetry section, I'd discovered a book that Eleanor had apparently special ordered years earlier but never picked up. It was a collection of poems about legacy and inheritance, with a handwritten inscription from the author to Eleanor thanking her for supporting independent poetry publications. I'd taken the book home and found a poem that seemed written specifically for my situation, describing wealth as borrowed light that gains meaning only when passed forward to illuminate others' paths. The phrase had stayed with me through countless decisions about grants and donations, through conversations with financial advisors about sustainable giving, through moments when the responsibility of stewarding Eleanor's trust felt overwhelming. Borrowed light. Money that belonged not to me but through me, resources that gained value through circulation rather than accumulation. That understanding had shaped my approach to philanthropy in ways that went beyond writing checks. I'd begun spending time with the organizations I supported, volunteering at the literacy program, visiting scholarship recipients at their schools, attending community meetings where residents discussed needs that weren't being met by traditional funding sources.
Eleanor's money was important, but Eleanor's values were transformative, and I could only honor them by understanding the communities and individuals my donations were meant to serve. The most profound change had been in how I saw myself and my place in the world. The inheritance had removed financial anxiety from my daily life, but more importantly, it had validated my instincts about what mattered most. For years, I'd internalized messages suggesting that my contentment was actually complacency, that my preference for quiet generosity over visible achievement indicated limited ambition rather than different priorities. Eleanor's choice had confirmed that kindness wasn't weakness, that choosing service over status represented strength rather than settling. Her trust had given me permission to live according to my values without apologizing for them, to measure my worth by my contribution rather than my accumulation, to find success in meaning rather than money. The inheritance had also taught me about the loneliness of significant wealth and the importance of maintaining authentic relationships. Several people had approached me after learning about Eleanor's bequest, suddenly interested in friendship or collaboration in ways that felt transparently motivated by financial opportunity rather than genuine connection. I'd learned to distinguish between people who saw me as a person and those who saw me as a resource, between relationships that enriched my life and those that simply sought to access my assets. The scholarship recipients had become some of my most treasured relationships precisely because our connection began with shared values rather than financial transactions. They'd known about my involvement with the program, but many had formed opinions about my character before learning about my wealth. Their continued respect and affection after discovering my financial circumstances felt like proof that Eleanor's assessment of my character had been accurate. Marcus had graduated with honors and been accepted to medical school with a full scholarship based on his academic performance and community service record. His success was deeply satisfying not because I'd funded his undergraduate education, but because Eleanor's investment had amplified existing qualities rather than creating artificial ones. He'd always been compassionate and dedicated. The scholarship had simply removed financial barriers that might have prevented him from pursuing his calling as a healer. During his graduation ceremony, I'd sat in the audience watching him walk across the stage and thought about Eleanor, wishing she could see how her trust was multiplying through the lives of people she'd never met but would have loved. The young man accepting his diploma had spent his undergraduate years volunteering at memory care facilities, reading to patients whose families couldn't visit regularly, carrying forward the kind of quiet service that Eleanor had valued above all other achievements. The graduation had also been attended by several other scholarship recipients, creating an impromptu reunion of Eleanor's extended family of choice. They'd shared stories about their academic progress, their volunteer work, their plans for using their education to serve their communities. Listening to their conversations, I'd understood that the program wasn't just providing educational access, it was creating a network of individuals united by shared values of service and compassion. Jessica had joined me at the graduation ceremony, her presence representing how much our relationship had evolved since the revelation at Morrison Law offices. She'd brought a card signed by the teenagers in her literacy program, congratulating Marcus on his achievement and thanking him for inspiring them to pursue their own educational goals. The gesture was small but meaningful, evidence of how Eleanor's influence was spreading through connections none of us had anticipated. As the ceremony concluded and families gathered for photos and celebrations, I'd felt Eleanor's presence in the joy and hope that filled the auditorium. Her money had made these moments possible, but her values had made them meaningful. She'd understood something that many wealthy people never discover, that the purpose of having resources is creating opportunities for others to flourish, that true legacy is measured not by what you accumulate but by what you enable. The drive home from the graduation had taken me through neighborhoods where I'd grown up, past the house where grandmother had lived, past the community center where I now volunteered, past the bookstore that had become a hub for literacy and learning. Eleanor's inheritance had changed my circumstances dramatically, but it hadn't changed my roots or my commitment to the community that had shaped me. That evening, I'd sat in my apartment reading through thank you letters from scholarship recipients, grant reports from organizations I'd supported, updates from programs that Eleanor's money had helped sustain or expand. Each document represented lives touched, opportunities created, potential fulfilled. The financial statements showed declining balances as money flowed out to worthy causes, but the human impact statements showed wealth multiplying in ways that compound interest could never match. Eleanor's legacy lived on, not just in the individuals who'd benefited from her generosity, but in their extending networks of influence. Scholarship recipients were becoming teachers, social workers, doctors, and advocates who would spend their careers serving others. Community programs were creating ripple effects of literacy, health, and opportunity that would touch generations of families. Her investment in character was generating returns in kindness, justice, and hope. 2 years after receiving Eleanor's inheritance, I'd finally understood what she'd meant in her letter about wealth being a tool whose value depended entirely on how it was used. Money without purpose was indeed meaningless, but money guided by values could transform lives, communities, and entire systems of opportunity. Her trust in my character had become my trust in others. Her faith in quiet service had become my approach to meaningful change. The inheritance had taught me that true wealth wasn't about having enough money to buy anything I wanted, it was about having enough purpose to know what was worth buying, enough wisdom to distinguish between wants and needs, enough compassion to share resources with others who could use them more effectively. Eleanor's gift had been financial, but her greater legacy was the understanding that every resource, money, time, attention, love, gain meaning through generous use, rather than careful preservation. As I prepared for bed that night, I'd looked around my simple apartment with its thrift store furniture and second-hand books, and felt completely content. The inheritance had given me options I'd never imagined, but it hadn't changed what made me happy. I still found joy in quiet evenings with good literature, satisfaction in meaningful work, fulfillment in authentic relationships with people who valued character over credentials. Eleanor had seen this in me before I'd fully seen it in myself, that contentment wasn't settling, that choosing meaning over money represented wisdom rather than limitation, that the greatest achievements often happened without recognition or applause. Her inheritance hadn't made me wealthy, it had made me capable of making others wealthy in ways that mattered most. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.